The woman who stole that box off my porch had no idea what was inside it. And honestly, that was the part that still bothers me most. She lifted it like trash, tucked it under one arm, and said, "Just loud enough for my doorbell camera to catch before the signal died." Well, if people leave junk sitting out, they cannot complain when it disappears. That junk was a hand-carved cedar music box my son had spent 7 months making from a naval base half a world away, and it was meant for my 8-year-old grandson, Finn, who had already asked 3 times that week if Uncle Nolan's Christmas surprise had come yet. My name is Raymond Hale, Ray to anybody who has ever shared a cup of bad diner coffee with me, and for 26 years I worked as a federal postal inspector out of Chicago, which means I spent most of my adult life chasing people who thought mail theft was a small crime until somebody in a windbreaker knocked on their door at sunrise. I retired to a little place called Briar Lake, Wisconsin, because my wife, June, said she wanted quiet winters, a real porch, and neighbors who waved with their whole hand instead of one finger. And for the first year, I thought we had found exactly that. Our house sat in a tidy development called Silver Pines, the kind of place with matching mailboxes, fake lanterns at every driveway, and an HOA board that behaved like it had been personally appointed by the Supreme Court. At the center of that little kingdom was Marla Whitcomb, HOA president, charity luncheon queen, queen of laminated notices, and the only woman I ever met who could make a clipboard look like a weapon. Marla was in her early 50s, always dressed like she was about to judge a flower show. Pearl earrings, wool coats, expensive boots, and that tight little smile people use when they're about to ruin your afternoon but want witnesses to think they're being polite. Her husband, Graham, ran what he called an estate resale business out of a converted carriage house behind their property, though most of us just knew it as the place where delivery trucks came and went at odd hours while Graham pretended not to see anybody looking. Now, I did not start out suspecting Marla, because even after years in federal law enforcement, you try not to assume the worst about the person who organizes the neighborhood cookie exchange. The first missing package happened 3 Christmases before everything blew up. Nolan, my son, was a Navy corpsman stationed in Guam at the time, and he had this old habit of making one handmade gift every year for Finn. When Nolan was 12, my father gave him a set of carving knives, nothing fancy, just old steel with cracked wooden handles, and Nolan took to it like the tools had been waiting for him. One year he carved Finn a little tugboat with working wheels. Another year he made a wooden fox with glass eyes he had ordered from some hobby shop in Maine. But that year, the first year, he made a cedar music box shaped like a lighthouse, with a tiny brass crank on the side and Finn's name burned into the bottom. It was not valuable in the way insurance companies care about value, but it had Nolan's hands all over it. His patience, his homesickness, his way of saying, "I am still part of this family, even when the Navy has me eating breakfast tomorrow while you are going to bed tonight." The tracking set had arrived at 3:32 on a Tuesday afternoon. June and I got home from town at 4:10. The porch was empty. I filed the report, made the calls, checked the neighborhood message board, and told myself it was probably some teenager being stupid or some porch pirate passing through. I even told Finn that the package must have gotten lost in the holiday rush, and I still remember the way he nodded like he was trying to be grown up about it, even though his lower lip was doing that little tremble kids do when they are trying not to disappoint the adults. Not too meaty. The next Christmas, 2 more of Nolan's packages vanished, one from our porch and one from June's sister's house after it had been forwarded there for safekeeping. By then, I had installed a doorbell camera and a small security camera under the porch beam, and both of them went blank within minutes of the delivery. Not turned away, not covered, blank. I knew what that meant, but knowing something and proving it are cousins, not twins. June cried that year in the laundry room where she thought I could not hear her. She was holding the empty shipping confirmation in one hand and one of Finn's little mittens in the other. And when I stepped in, she said, "Ray, I can replace a toy, but how do I replace the feeling that somebody keeps taking from him before he even gets to open it?" That sentence stayed with me. It sat in my chest for a full year. By the 3rd December, I was done pretending we had bad luck. 4 packages disappeared before the 10th of the month. Not all from Nolan, but all from our porch. All during the same narrow afternoon window when June was volunteering at the library and I was usually out walking a lake road. Each time the cameras dropped for a few minutes. Each time the delivery scan was clean. Each time Marla appeared on the community page within an hour. reminding residents that Silver Pines could not be responsible for unsecured deliveries and that perhaps some households should consider being more organized during the holidays. That was Marla's gift, by the way. She could insult you and make it sound like a policy update. So, one Wednesday morning, while snow ticked against the kitchen windows and June was making coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, I sat down with a yellow legal pad and wrote every incident out by hand. Dates, times, carriers, weather, camera outages, neighbor sightings, gate access logs I had no official right to possess but had quietly copied after a board member left them on a clubhouse table during bingo night. Old habits do not retire just because you do. The pattern formed faster than I wanted it to. Weekdays only, between 20 hours and 4 p.m., always after a delivery notification, always during a short Wi-Fi disruption, never when June's old Buick was in the driveway, never on garbage day, when the street had too many people wandering around. Whoever was doing it knew our schedule, knew the neighborhood, and knew just enough about consumer electronics to knock cameras offline without smashing anything. That ruled out kids. It ruled out random thieves. It ruled in somebody comfortable enough to walk up to my porch in daylight and entitled enough to believe no one would challenge them. I borrowed an RF meter from an old friend in Milwaukee, built a crude directional antenna in my garage out of copper wire, plywood scraps, and the broom handle June had been asking me to throw away since Easter. And over the next 2 afternoons, I drove Silver Pines like a man looking for a lost dog. I stopped at corners, pretended to check my phone, took signal readings, circled back, waited, measured again. By the end of the second day, the strongest hits came from the West Loop, near the big houses with lake views and heated driveways. By the fourth pass, the signal narrowed to one property, Marla Whitcomb's. I remember sitting in my truck across from her place, heater blowing, notebook open on my knee, watching her white Lincoln SUV sit in the circular drive like a yacht parked on snow. And I actually laughed once, not because it was funny, but because some part of me had known it would be her. Marla did not hate packages. Marla hated being ignored. She had fined us twice for June's garden flags, once for having firewood stacked 6 inches too far from the garage wall, and once, my personal favorite, for a welcome mat she called visually inconsistent with community standards. But the real trouble started when I spoke against her at an HOA meeting after she tried to force old Mr. Alvarez to repaint his wheelchair ramp because the stain did not match his trim. Marla never forgave public embarrassment. People like her do not just want rules followed. They want people to know who owns the rules. That night, I told June what I had found. She sat at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around her mug, listening without interrupting. When I finished, she looked out toward the dark porch and said, "Are you going to call the police?" I said, "Yes." Then she looked back at me, and I knew she had been married to me too long to accept the first answer. "Ray," she said, "are you only going to call the police?" I looked at the empty place on the mantel where Finn's Lighthouse music box should have been sitting, and I said, "No, honey. I think this year Marla is going to open one more package." I made 2 phone calls the next morning, one official enough to keep me honest and one unofficial enough to keep me useful. The official call went to Deputy Lena Ortiz of the County Sheriff's Office, a woman with tired eyes, a steady voice, and the kind of patience you only get from either raising teenagers or working small-town law enforcement in December. I laid out what I had: the delivery scans, the camera outages, the RF readings, the pattern, and Marla's name. And to her credit, she did not laugh, did not sigh, did not tell me to fill out a form online and pray to the holiday gods. She said, "Mr. Hale, if what you are describing is accurate, this is bigger than one missing package." And I said, "Deputy, with respect, I spent half my life saying that exact sentence to people who did not believe me." The second call went to Elias Mercer, an old postal inspection friend out of St. Paul, retired in theory but still connected to enough people that when he said he would ask around, things usually started moving before lunch. Elias had a voice like gravel in a coffee can and the moral flexibility of a man who believed paperwork was important, but timing was more important. I sent him my notes, photos, signal logs, and the few screenshots I had from the neighborhood page where Marla kept warning everyone not to embarrass Silver Pines by making wild accusations. By dinner, Elias called back and said, "Ray, you sitting down?" I said, "I am married to June. I am always emotionally prepared." He did not laugh. He said Graham Whitcomb's resale account has been listing new in-box electronics, handmade toys, specialty medical supplies, and artisan Christmas pieces for 2 years. And one of the listings from last January is a cedar lighthouse music box with the name Finn burned underneath. I had heard bad news in my life. I had delivered bad news too. But there is a certain kind of anger that does not arrive hot. It arrives cold and quiet, like somebody opened a door in your chest and let winter in. June was standing at the sink when I put the phone down. She looked at my face and knew. She did not ask if it was Nolan's. She just whispered, "Oh, Ray," and I said, "Yeah." That night, I went to the garage and stood at my workbench under that humming fluorescent light, staring at half-finished birdhouses, old tools, coffee cans full of screws, the regular clatter of a retired man pretending he has hobbies and not surveillance instincts. I knew we needed evidence nobody could explain away. Not a hunch, not a pattern, not my old badge and my wounded pride. We needed Marla touching the box, taking the box, moving the box, opening the box, and carrying the proof on her own skin before she had time to call a board meeting and declare herself the victim of community hostility. So I built her a Christmas present. I started with a plain brown carrier box, 12 inches long, large enough to seem ordinary, heavy enough to feel worth stealing. Inside, I mounted a tiny camera in the folded seam, the kind hunters use to catch raccoons at bird feeders, motion-activated, battery-fresh, angled wide. I tucked a tracker into the cardboard wall, sealed so cleanly you would have needed a razor and suspicion to find it. Then came the marking powder, not glitter bomb nonsense from the internet, though I will admit I watched a few of those videos and enjoyed myself more than a grown man should. This was old-school tracing powder, invisible in daylight, bright blue under ultraviolet light, fine enough to cling to gloves, cuffs, collars, hair, steering wheels, purse straps, anything it touched. I mixed it with a little biodegradable shimmer dust June found at a craft store, because June said, if the woman is going to ruin Christmas, at least let her sparkle for it, and that right there is why I married her. The trigger was simple, a spring arm held back by a magnet, the magnet held in place by the lid. The moment the lid opened, more than half an inch, the arm snapped forward and puffed the powder out through 2 paper tubes. I tested it in the garage using one of my old fishing jackets. The jacket looked perfectly normal until June hit it with a blacklight flashlight and the whole sleeve lit up like a nightclub crime scene. She stared at it for a second, then said, "Ray, that is both childish and legally satisfying." I said, "Those are my 2 favorite categories." While I worked the box, June worked the neighborhood, and I have to say, if the federal government had ever hired that woman, half the Midwest would have confessed before supper. She started with Mr. Furse Alvarez, the retired machinist with a wheelchair ramp Marla hated. He had lost insulin cooler packs twice. Then she went to Becky and Tom Ridley, the young couple across the pond, whose twins had lost birthday gifts, and whose complaint Marla had publicly called unfortunate but exaggerated. By the end of the weekend, we had 11 households, 37 missing packages, 4 missing prescription deliveries, 2 lost handmade Christmas gifts, and 1 widow named Darlene Pruitt who cried at our kitchen table because the last scarf her sister knitted before she died had vanished from Darlene's porch, and Marla later told her that sentimental items should not be shipped during peak season. No one did it for June. She got very quiet, and when June gets quiet, even weather systems change direction. She bought a dozen small ultraviolet flashlights from the hardware store, tied silver ribbon around each one, and handed them out like party favors. She told everyone, "Bring this to the Briar Lake Winter Walk on Saturday night, and when Ray gives the signal, point it where I point mine." Most of them did not ask questions. People who have been made to feel foolish for telling the truth do not need long explanations when someone finally believes them. The Winter Walk was Marla's favorite event of the year, mostly because it gave her a stage. The town closed Main Street, strung lights from the old maple trees, set up cocoa tents, a children's choir, a charity raffle, and a big ceremonial lantern lighting at 7 sharp. Marla chaired the planning committee and always gave the opening remarks in a red coat that made her look, in her own mind, like the First Lady of Gingerbread. Deputy Ortiz wanted to arrest her quietly if the bait worked. Elias agreed. Even I knew they were right on paper. But on paper did not have Finn asking why Uncle Nolan's gifts never found our house. On paper did not have Darlene Pruitt sitting at my kitchen table with tissues balled in both hands. On paper did not have Marla standing at meeting after meeting telling everyone the thefts were probably exaggerated by careless residents trying to shift blame. I told Lena I want her caught clean. But I want the town to understand who has been calling them careless. Lena rubbed her forehead and said, Ray, public humiliation is not a law enforcement strategy. I said, no, but sunlight is. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, the sentence every retired investigator loves and every sheriff's department regrets. Do not make me sorry. I trusted you. The bait package was logged through the county office under supervision and delivered to my porch on Thursday at 2:11 in the afternoon by a deputy in a borrowed delivery vest. I was 3 houses down in Mr. Alvarez's front room with June, Lena, Elias on speakerphone, 2 laptops, and a plate of almond cookies. Mrs. Alvarez kept refilling like we were all there for bridge club instead of a felony. At 2018, my porch camera went dead. At 2:20, the RF meter jumped. At 2:23, Marla's white Lincoln rolled into view, slow as a shark under ice. She parked at the curb, not in the driveway, because thieves are funny about manners. She stepped out in camel-colored boots and a cream wool coat, glanced up and down the street, and walked to my porch like she had written herself permission. Through binoculars, I saw her read the label. I had made it from a fake company called North Harbor Woodcraft, and under recipient I had written Raymond Hale, with a small gift note tucked under the ribbon that said, For Finn, from Uncle Nolan, made it home at last. Marla smiled, not a big smile, just a small tightening at one corner of her mouth. The kind of smile people get when they think the universe has once again agreed with them. She lifted the box, tucked it under her arm, and as she turned away, the camera came back for half a second and caught her saying, Some people never learn. Well, she was right about that. The tracker showed her drive straight home, through the west gate, up the hill, around behind the Whitcomb place to Graham's carriage house. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then the camera woke up. We saw Graham's hands first, pale and soft, cutting the tape with a pocket knife. Marla stood beside him still wearing her coat, impatient, tapping one gloved finger on the table. Graham said, If this is another handmade thing, don't list it until after New Year's. Marla said, Oh, relax. Ray Hale is too busy playing detective to notice what is right under his nose. Then Graham lifted the lid. The spring snapped. The powder bloomed. Marla screamed so loud Mrs. Alvarez dropped the cookie tray. On the laptop screen, both Whitcombs stumbled backward through a bright invisible cloud they could not yet see, coughing, swatting their faces. Graham yelling, What the hell is this? Marla yelling, Get it off me, get it off me. And Lena Ortiz, sitting beside me with one hand over her mouth, whispered, Mr. Hale, I'm going to pretend I did not enjoy that. I said, Deputy, that makes one of us. The feet kept rolling as they dragged the box to a utility sink, scrubbed their hands, wiped the table, argued about whether to burn it, and shoved it into a trash bag and carried it outside behind the carriage house. The tracker never stopped. The camera caught enough, the audio caught more, and when Marla finally walked back toward her house, still brushing at her coat like pride could be dusted off if you worked hard enough, June leaned close to the screen, smiled in a way I had only seen twice in 40 years, and said, Saturday night is going to be beautiful. By Saturday morning, Marla Whitcomb had become the most overdressed woman in Briar Lake. She wore gloves inside the bakery, gloves at the charity raffle table, gloves while signing clipboard forms, and a scarf wrapped so high around her neck she looked like she was either hiding a rash or preparing to cross the Arctic on foot. June and I saw her around noon outside the old pharmacy, standing under a string of white lights while 2 festival volunteers asked about the lantern order. And even from across the street, I could see how stiff she was trying to be, how carefully she held her shoulders, how badly she wanted to look normal. That is the funny thing about guilt. It makes ordinary movements feel rehearsed. Deputy Ortiz had already collected the bait box from behind the carriage house that morning. Tracker still active, camera still sealed, chain of custody cleaner than a church kitchen before Easter. Elias had gotten a federal inspector out of Madison looped in by then, because once the camera caught Graham talking about listings and handmade items and waiting until after New Year's, this stopped being a neighborhood mess and started smelling like a trafficking operation. Before sunset, they had a warrant ready for Graham's resale shop, and by 6:15, 3 unmarked vehicles were sitting 2 roads over from the Whitcomb property, while Marla stood on Main Street, adjusting her red coat like nothing in the world was coming for her. The Briar Lake Winter Walk always looked like something from a snow globe if the snow globe had zoning disputes and overpriced cocoa. Main Street was closed to traffic. Kids were running around with paper lanterns. The Methodist choir was warming up by the courthouse steps. and the big town pines stood in the square wrapped in dark strands of lights waiting for Marla's grand countdown. She loved that countdown. Every year she held the microphone like she had personally invented Christmas, and every year she reminded everyone that strong communities were built on respect, order, and shared standards, which was Marla language for do what I say and thank me afterward. June stood beside me near the cocoa tent, calm as Sunday morning, with her little UV flashlight tucked inside her mitten. Around us, 11 other households had spread quietly through the crowd. Mr. Alvarez sat in his wheelchair near the front. Becky Ridley had one twin on each side of her. Darlene Pruitt stood under a maple tree holding her flashlight in both hands like it was something holy. And for the first time in 3 years, nobody looked embarrassed about being there. At 6:58, the mayor introduced Marla. She stepped up onto the temporary stage, red coat buttoned tight, cream gloves spotless in normal light, scarf pinned with a gold snowflake brooch, and she smiled at the crowd with that same polished little expression she used when handing out fines. "Good evening, Briar Lake," she said, her voice warm enough to butter toast. "Tonight is about trust, tradition, and the kind of neighborhood values that keep us safe." I felt June's hand slide into mine. Marla kept talking, and I will give her this. The woman had nerve. She spoke about package thefts, actually stood there under 1,000 Christmas bulbs and told people that fear could divide a community if residents gave in to suspicion and gossip. She said, "We must resist the urge to accuse without proof." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because somewhere behind her house, Graham was probably watching sheriff's deputies open boxes with other people's names on them. At 7 sharp, Marla raised one gloved hand and led the countdown. 10, 9, 8. The children shouted with her. 7s, 6, 5. And I looked at Finn, standing with my daughter near the front, his cheeks red from the cold, his eyes fixed on the tree. Still too young to understand that adults can steal more than things. They can steal trust and then lecture you about manners. 2, 1. The pine exploded into warm white light. People cheered. The choir started singing. Marla turned toward the crowd, glowing with victory in the ordinary way, and then Mayor Leland Cross stepped back to the microphone and said, "Folks, before we continue, Deputy Ortiz has a brief community safety announcement." Marla's face changed so fast most people missed it, but I did not. The smile stayed, but the eyes went flat. Lena Ortiz climbed the steps in uniform, no drama, no raised voice. Just a folder in one hand and the calm authority of somebody who had slept well because the evidence was good. She said, "Over the past several weeks, our office has been assisting in an investigation into organized package theft connected to Silver Pines and surrounding neighborhoods." A few people murmured. Marla took one step back. Lena continued, "Some of you here tonight were given small lights by Mrs. June Hale. If you received one, please turn it on now," and pointed toward the stage. For half a second, nothing happened. Then June lifted hers, Mr. Alvarez lifted his, Darlene lifted hers. The Ridley twins lifted theirs like magic wands. 11 beams of ultraviolet light crossed the cold air and landed on Marla Whitcomb. Her gloves lit first, a violent electric blue from fingertip to wrist. Then her scarf flashed in streaks around her throat. Then the front of her red coat bloomed with a ghostly shimmer. Then her jawline, her hairline, the edge of one cheek where she must have touched her face after opening the box. The whole crowd went quiet in a way I had never heard a crowd go quiet before. Not confused quiet, understanding quiet. Marla looked down at her hands, and for one naked second, all the polish fell off her. She looked like a child caught with stolen candy, except the candy was 37 packages, 4 prescription deliveries, a dead woman's scarf, and my grandson's handmade lighthouse. She whispered, "This is harassment." Lena said, "No, ma'am, this is evidence." 2 deputies stepped forward. At the same moment, Lena's radio crackled, and Graham Whitcomb was reported in custody behind the resale shop, standing beside shelves of sealed packages, half of them still wearing shipping labels. Marla tried one last time to become important. She straightened her shoulders and said, "I am the HOA president. You cannot do this here." And Lena, "Bless that woman forever," said Mrs. Whitcomb. "That title is not recognized by the state of Wisconsin as immunity from theft." The handcuffs clicked so clearly that people in the second row heard them. Nobody booed. Nobody clapped at first either. They just watched her step down from the stage. Blue, glowing hands cuffed in front of her. while every rule she had ever used to make people feel small turned to ash around her. Then Darlene Pruitt began to cry, and Mr. Alvarez reached over from his wheelchair and took her hand. And somehow that broke the spell. People started talking all at once. Someone said my mother's medicine. Someone else said our twins' birthday box. Finn looked up at me and asked, "Grandpa, did she take Uncle Nolan's present too?" I got down on one knee in the snow and said, "Yeah, buddy, she did, but she does not get to keep it." 3 days later, a postal inspector brought the Cedar Lighthouse music box to a house in a plain evidence bag, and Nolan watched over video call from Guam while Finn turned the little brass crank for the first time. The tune was rough and sweet and slightly off-key, just like Nolan's first attempts at everything had always been. And June cried openly at the kitchen table while pretending she was wiping flour off her hands. In the months that followed, Graham took a plea deal, Marla lost the house, the HOA held an emergency election, and Mr. Alvarez, who never wanted power in his life, became board president by unanimous vote because everybody trusted him not to enjoy it. June started a neighborhood package watch with retirees signing up for porch duty in 2-hour shifts, and by the next Christmas, not one package went missing in Silver Pines. As for me, people still ask if I regret making it public. Maybe I should say yes. Maybe the noble answer is that justice should be quiet, clean, handled in offices with forms and signatures. But I think about Marla standing on that stage telling people not to accuse without proof while blue powder was sitting on her skin. And I think about Finn winding that music box with both hands. And I think there are moments when a community does not just need an arrest. It needs to see the lie under the light. So tell me honestly, if someone in your neighborhood used power, politeness, and a fake smile to steal from families for years, would you let the police handle it quietly? Or would you want every person they shamed to be standing there when the truth finally showed up glowing on their hands? Drop your answer in the comments, because I have learned that people feel very differently about justice when it happens in public. And if you ever had a package stolen, or dealt with an HOA tyrant who thought a clipboard made them royalty, share this story with someone who understands. Hit subscribe and come back for the next one. Because in small towns, the loudest people are not always the strongest. Sometimes they're just the last ones to realize the quiet people have been keeping receipts.